So, hello and thank you for listening to this talk. My name's Sarah and I'm an ecologist. So the idea behind my short talk was to make sure nature isn't sidelined in the climate emergency, as often it looks as if it's a green industry approach to climate emergency on Orkney. The overall message I want to convey is that we are a part of nature. We've spent decades increasingly distancing ourselves from it. We now live in a world where most of the younger generation experience nature virtually and devoid of any major sensory experience. The current pandemic has allowed us a chance to reset. It is worth pointing out that the current pandemic was partly initiated by our transgression into other natural systems. But yes, it has also given us an opportunity to reset, to slow down and to let nature back in, and that has been shown globally across different countries. It's allowed people a chance to enjoy the natural world and see the benefits of it. It has also proven the findings of the 2019 Nature Scientific Report that nature is actually central to our well-being. With many people using lockdown to walk, cycle and run outside, bike sales have gone up. Many places have sold out of bikes. And it's also given nature a much needed breathing space. One of these lots of these nature breathing spaces, not just on Orkney but the rest of the UK, has been the bloom in orchids, with hundreds appearing on verges, grass areas and lawns. Unfortunately, once we eased out of lockdown and the grass verges could get cut again, we lost all of this gain from the earlier lockdown period. And this should give us pause for thought on really how we plan and how we do things. I'm going to talk more about urban nature later on in this talk. But it should be a pause for thought that actually often having biodiversity gains doesn't require huge amounts of money and input put into it. It just actually requires us to stop and sometimes to just not do things. We also just need to end the them and us attitude to the natural world. As I say, we are a part of nature. We need to see it as a friend and not a foe. And we need to really work to build an inclusive approach to restoring nature, one that avoids exclusionary ideologies or political separatism and involves everybody with an interest. So I wanted to go through a couple of local perspectives. I want to start by focusing on natural habitats. We call them the honeypots. So Orkney markets itself on its natural landscapes, especially on social media, and sells a holiday dream of a green holiday with opportunities to explore it safely and carbon free. Are often very limited. We have a book on Orkney wildflowers, one also on Orkney's bird population that has locations in it, and readers should be able to easily visit these locations to look for the flowers without having to tackle endless barbed wire or feeling awkward traversing the land. We have minimal paths and a core path network that lists as many roads as paths on it. And again, I will talk more on that when I will talk more about kind of urban nature landscapes. But this also gives a further negative of the limited places to visit, as it puts extra pressure on these honeypot sites like Yesme, the last local stand of Primula Scotia or Scots Primrose. Scots Primrose tells an interesting story of the state of an important gradient of plant communities on a coastland. Forms part of the final sequence from rocky mineral cliff edge vegetation through coastal heathland to short turf grassland. There's a mosaic of vegetation that form a ring around the coastal margins of Orkney, but Primula Scotia being confined to Yesme shows how marginalised and fragmented that habitat gradient has become. I believe it would truly be a good, realistic goal to try to look to re-establish as much of this mosaic of plant communities on Orkney as possible, providing a biologically diverse, rich series of plant communities that include mosses and lichens and therefore help to naturally absorb atmospheric carbon all year round and help to offset the Orkney agricultural carbon emissions. This, coupled with allowing inland peatland wetland plant communities to re-expand, would provide a more benefit and less cost than tree planting, which, unless you are planting small mature trees, brings little nature or carbon absorption benefit for at least the first decade. Our natural environments are just part of the picture. At the opposite end of the spectrum is our agricultural urban landscapes that fragment them. Our over-neatness and planning approach provide little place for nature, placing more pressure on these fragmented natural systems. Ecological corridors and networks are increasingly important in our fragmented natural world. And with many examples, such as rely increasingly on gardens to create corridors and havens for pollinators, birds and small mammals. But on Orkney, available friendly gardens are sporadic, with many being concreted or decked over or left as low-value grassland. We continue to put up housing estates and allow planning for houses that remove value from the natural world. We should be incorporating glades, hedgerows, meadows and wetlands into our planning to allow nature to live alongside us. And that is the real key here, is that we have to start living alongside nature. But perhaps the most essential ecological corridor are road verges and field margins. These are probably the most classical example of ecological corridors, often widely talked about in ecology. And the message is simple, coming from people like Plant Life Scotland and many other organisations, that we have to stop cutting them in the spring and summer. There are ways to cut them that actually helps remove the more dominant grass species and allows wildflowers to come up, but this cutting all the way down and removing every single remnant of wildflower from it really has to stop. These verges are critical for our pollinators and insect communities, which in turn are important for the higher food web. In cutting them, we may not only remove a vital habitat, but also avoid tackling the issue of proper green infrastructure. Road verges aren't as suitable a substitute for paths and cycleways, which is almost non-existent on our islands. The pandemic has shown this shortfall by squeezing pedestrians onto the paths that we do have, and many having to walk on roads that certainly aren't safe and quiet. So to finish, if we want to really embrace expanding nature with creating a green infrastructure, we can not only substantially improve the physical and mental health of those who reside here, but also open up new avenues for a slower post-pandemic tourism with it. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, I'm an organic farmer in Orkney. I've been farming organic for about 10 years now. And within the framing of organic farming, I started to do rotational grazing back in 2009. But I was kind of not doing it very well. So I researched in America about what they call long rotation, high intensity grazing, which involves shifting the cattle once a day, putting them in large groups and shifting them every day, and sometimes even more than once every day. And this gives the grass a long rest between grazings, and just gives you more yield in the end of the day. So this system is often referred to as mob grazing. So in this mob grazing, we try to not graze the plants all the way down. You can see from this slide that when you take all the vegetation off, or at least 90% off, the roots are quite small, and it takes a long while for the plant to recover. If you take off 70%, the roots are a bit bigger. If you only take off 50%, the roots are much larger, and it's the root mass in the soil that helps improve the soil. So we try to graze where we just take half the grass off, then some of the grass is trampled in, and then we move them on, and we only come back after about 40 to 60 days. So you talk about taking 1/3, trampling in 1/3, and leaving 1/3. So this system was developed in America, but it's now, well, it's basically gone viral around the world, but it's not used very widely. The system works best with a multi-species mix. If you're sowing grass, we tend to sow at least 10 species, a mixture of grasses, legumes, which are clovers, which fix nitrogen, and herbs. It seems to be the mixture that makes the difference, because you get a difference in rooting depth with the different plants, and the different plants interact in the soil, which helps improve the soil. All the time that the plants are growing, they're leaking a certain amount of carbon into the soil. So it's actually the root mass that makes a difference in this system. So the other thing is that the plants feed the soil organisms, so you get more worms and more microbes in the soil. So with a system of farming, we see the following benefits. We see much better soil because you get better structure, you have faster infiltration of water, which mitigates the problems of flooding. But also we get more water retained in the soil because we have better structure, more pore space, and more organic matter, which mitigates the problems of drought. So it's a win-win situation for the farmer all round. We also have reduced inputs to farming with this system, with much less chemicals needed. We obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but we do need less fertilizer. There's more nitrogen fixation happening. There's more mineralization of nutrients in the soil because there's more root mass, more microbes. And we don't need as much fungicides or weed killers. Weeds are actually, sometimes the weeds become herbs and sometimes the weeds get eliminated. Hopefully both happens, but it's still a work in progress, certainly as far as I'm concerned. We also have, even if we don't create it artificially, we have increased biodiversity of plants if we mow graze, because, well, it's difficult to explain, but basically we get an increase in the number of species of plants, which of course helps with the environment and the soil for the microbes, but it also helps with the wider biodiversity of birds, mammals, etc., that are just in the wild. And the other thing is, the other benefit is the healthier plants lead to healthier animals, because the mixture of different species is better for the gut, or especially the ruminants that we're feeding mainly, because they have a better mix of gut flora in the rumen. So it gives you better health of the animals and better performance. And finally, with this regenerative farming system, we get net sequestration of carbon in the soil if we're doing it right. You can see in this picture, of course, the worms. You also see the good structure in the soil, and you also see the roots. and it's really the roots leaking carbon into the soil that gives you the increase in organic matter, and that is really the sequestration of carbon in the soil, which of course is obviously going to be good for the planet and good for the environment, and hopefully good for my profitability. If you imagine the buffalo roaming in the prairies in the 1800s, this is the kind of system we're trying to mimic. I don't suppose we'll ever get to the stage they got, with the soil 8 feet deep and grass higher than a man sitting on a horse. But that's basically what we're trying to mimic with this system, and make farming more sustainable through regenerating the soil, and hopefully it's better for the environment in terms of biodiversity, and also better for what would you say, CO2 levels in the air, because we're helping to fix that back in the soil. That's basically it in a nutshell. Regenerative farming, I think, is the way to go. Thank you for listening.